Knowing that, I'm going to jump in. And for those that don't know us already, we are BOI. We are a global AI transformation studio, and I am calling you based out of our New York office. So our key HQs are in New York and in Belgium, and we're very much focused on AI transformation across both the enterprise, but also specifically the innovation, marketing, and commercial functions as well. So, the topic of today, why does AI adoption feel so difficult? And before we talk about stages or models, I think it's kind of important to name the experience that a lot of organizations and people are having right now, which is that AI adoption feels really hard. And it's not because people are resistant or because the tools are bad. It feels hard because this is fundamentally a behavioral change without a clear roadmap, basically. So there's no single right way to start. There's no agreed sequence. There's no kind of stable best practice yet. So people are experimenting, and early results can be really uneven. They can be really unpredictable. And some days AI feels really powerful, and some days it just feels super disappointing. So at the same time, we're also seeing that expectations are moving way faster than confidence or skill. And leaders are seeing the potential and they want impact, and teams are still figuring out what good even looks like. And that creates kind of a tension, especially as a lot of AI leaders will have spent probably months vetting different vendors, getting to know different tools, designing internal systems before their launch. So there's a small kind of cohort that know the tools really well. And then there's a lot of folks that are onboarding and trying to adopt the tools that are learning about it for the first time. And that kind of creates a delta between folks that know it really well on day one and folks that are just learning about it for the first time. So what's actually happening is that AI isn't just changing the tools, it's really changing how we think and how we work. So we're going to go through a framework today, but one of the first things that I want to acknowledge is that there are a lot of different AI tools out there, which means that they operate in different ways. They have different potential adoption paths. They could be really simple SaaS tools. They could be end-to-end capabilities that are either built internally or with an external partner. So many different types of AI out there. And what we have seen is that there is this 5-stage framework that we've actually seen be really effective across a pretty broad array of AI proof of concepts, pilots, full end-to-end enterprise capabilities. This does seem to work across a good majority of them. Maybe not every single one, but we've built a lot of different AI capabilities here at BOI. We've done a lot of adoption programs for folks that maybe are using SaaS tools or have built their own internal tools. And we do think that this 5-stage framework has been pretty effective. So what we essentially are doing is, instead of treating adoption as kind of a single outcome, meaning something you'd have or you don't have, we want to think of this as a progression. So companies move through different stages, and at each stage, you build a different kind of capability. So from onboarding all the way through to cultural adoption. And what is really important is honestly not just the labels, but the idea that each stage has a very distinct, different job to do. So onboarding is about confidence and literacy. Assisted use is more about efficiency. Integrated use is changing workflows. Strategic adoption is improving judgment. And cultural adoption is this kind of moment where AI just feels invisible and expected. Where problems arise is when we expect outcomes from a later stage while teams are still operating in a much earlier stage. And that's where frustration starts to really set in. So this model is not necessarily just about speed, but it's about the right sequencing. And we'll go through each of these stages and talk about how to design effectively for each of these stages, what you can expect and what you need to measure before moving on to the next stage. People don't move through AI adoption in a particularly rational way. They do move through it in an emotional way. So it's something that we always keep in mind when we think about AI adoption and the different stages of AI adoption. So as we go through each of these, it's worth bearing in mind that we have the rational way forward, and we really want to match that with the kind of real emotional realities of us as humans learning enterprise AI and adopting enterprise AI into the way that we have worked for many, many years. So a common misconception is that AI adoption is usage. If people have access, if they've been trained, if usage numbers go up, then we just assume that adoption is happening. But it's actually a very shallow and kind of misleading definition. Just because people are using AI, it doesn't mean that the job is done. It doesn't mean that the work has changed. It doesn't mean that decisions have improved or a capability has been built. What it does do is actually creates false signals of progress. So things look good on the surface, but underneath the behaviors haven't actually shifted yet. And what ends up happening is that this misconception drives just really unrealistic expectations. Leaders are thinking, okay, people are using AI, where's the impact? And teams are feeling pressure to perform before they've even had the chance to build confidence or fluency or shared ways of working. So adoption is not the same as usage, and it's important that we separate the two. Otherwise, they kind of operate in conflict to one another and make it difficult to figure out why AI is or isn't delivering what we expect. So, jumping into each of the stages. And the first couple of stages are where most companies are right now. So I'll spend more time on stages maybe 1 through 3 than on 4 and 5. But happy to expand on any of these at the end in the Q&A. So stage 1, at this stage, the biggest mistake that companies make is assuming that onboarding is about teaching people how AI works, which it's not. It's about helping people decide really whether AI is worth their time and their attention. At this point, most people, I would say, have access to AI or consumer AI at least, which means that what they don't have is that kind of enterprise clarity. And what they're doing is asking, when does this actually help me? Why do these results feel inconsistent sometimes? How much effort should I actually put into this before I give up, basically? So if you don't design for those questions, people quietly disengage. It's kind of the quiet quitting of enterprise AI. So the first design priority when you are responsible for AI adoption, when you are thinking about what is the right path for teams to use this and get to impact as fast as possible, then we always say prioritize answering the very practical question of what's in this for your team's day-to-day work. Not in theory, but in concrete tasks that they're already doing. So you need a small kind of opinionated set of tasks where AI reliably adds value. So not dozens of different use cases, 2 or 3 is enough, but that is a really strong first way in this initial stage. The second design goal is inconsistent, or design challenge, I should say, is inconsistency. The goal is consistency. So a lot of early AI results can vary pretty dramatically, and oftentimes without explanation for the folks that are using the AI. And what happens is that people interpret that as unreliability. So effective onboarding needs examples that very explicitly show why results vary. What changes when instructions are vague versus what changes when instructions are specific? When context is missing versus when you have context, or when when expectations are unrealistic. It just turns that kind of confusion into a real blocker. So this stage does need really strong shared expectations of what good looks like. So if people think that AI output needs to be perfect, then what happens is they end up kind of overworking it, or they end up abandoning it. So when you're thinking about onboarding design, make sure that you're actively considering that quality bar. In a way, you can lower it. It doesn't have to be permanently, but it does have to be intentionally, so that people can actually build that confidence without friction. And the kind of way that you know that this onboarding stage is working is when people start to come back to AI for the same tasks. You start to see the frustration drop pretty enormously. Usage becomes a lot more intentional. And the key risk here is mistaking that initial curiosity for commitment. You really have to design for that commitment. So interest alone doesn't mean that onboarding has done its job. But if you can design around these kind of four core principles on the left box here, we've seen that for most types of enterprise AI and most types of organizations with different types of teams, we've seen that be a pretty effective way to move through the onboarding phase, which in my opinion is actually the hardest of the five stages by quite a margin. What is kind of interesting with the onboarding transition from one to two and getting to that next stage is that there's a lot of studies on why people quit the gym that are very relevant here. So four key reasons that people quit the gym is because they don't know what to do, they don't see early progress, the effort feels disproportionate to the results, or they feel like this is something they should do, not something that they want to do. And I think a lot of these are probably pretty familiar and resonating with folks here, maybe that have been working on the rollout of their enterprise AI capabilities and tools. But early AI adoption really does often fail for the same reasons, which is people have access, they may be curious, but without those starting points, without those early wins, and without being able to basically visualize realistic expectations, they quietly disengage. So you're ready to move on from onboarding, not when everyone has been trained and usage spikes for a couple of weeks, but you're ready to move on when this kind of more subtle shift happens of people stopping kind of questioning whether AI is worth using and in replacing that with using it repeatedly for specific tasks because they know in those tasks it clearly helps. So at that point, AI has earned a place in their workflow, even if in this early stage, it's still basic. So moving on to stage two. So assisted use. If stage one onboarding is about, is AI worth my time? Then stage two is basically answering a different question, which is, can I rely on this to actually save time week after week? And this can be a stage that some teams find tricky, some teams can stall at because they underestimate how much design, again, this stage requires. If you leave this alone, then people will either overinvest effort to get really perfect outputs, or they keep using AI in a way that feels clever but is inefficient. So again, a couple of really effective design moves here that we've seen really work are to do things like eliminate blank page work, meaning explicitly decide which types of work should no longer start from scratch. So that could be first drafts, it could be research summaries or option lists or um, outlines. But the point is not to just recommend AI. The point is to start to change the starting condition, or what we call the starting condition of the work. Second thing that we've seen be really helpful is standardizing a small number of AI first moments. So first one around eliminating blank page work. Second one about being really intentional about AI first start points. So if AI is optional everywhere, then it's basically a default nowhere. So pick 2 or 3 moments where AI is assumed to remove decision fatigue or make usage really repeatable, and really stick to those moments and try and share those across the team that's using whichever AI tool you're using. So third design point here is around what we call effort constraints. So if people don't know how much effort is enough effort, then they'll just keep refining AI outputs all the time until time savings disappear. There's no point spending 45 minutes trying to refine outputs when the manual task could have just been done in 5 minutes. So you need really explicit norms like 10 minutes, one iteration, move on, for example. It sounds small, but it is actually what turns AI into a productivity tool rather than this kind of labored craftsmanship exercise. Last one here, you really do need to actively remove pressure for the AI outputs to be impressive. Very much tied to this last point. But assisted use in this stage is not, the goal is not quality uh, breakthroughs. It's about speed, momentum, freeing up attention, and getting you to a further starting point than you had before. So this stage is going to feel like it's working when AI starts to feel kind of boring. People default to it, the work is starting faster, and tasks just take a lot less effort over time. And the biggest risk here is actually confusing heavy individual use with progress. So until these patterns are shared, it's not going to feel quite yet like a capability. And later in this webinar, we'll talk a little bit about the different types of users that you'll encounter as you go through your AI adoption program. So you're ready to move on from stage 2 when AI is no longer just speeding up individual tasks, but it actually leads to teams questioning whether the way the work is structured still makes sense. So up until this point, AI is helping people do basically the same work faster. There will be a certain point where that creates friction. People are going to notice duplication or rework or handoffs that feel unnecessary now that AI has got to the quality threshold that they were looking for. So when you start to recognize that moment, there's a bit of a fork in the road where either teams can stagnate at productivity gains, or they could, potentially start to burn out to optimize tasks that should actually be redesigned. So this is your point to say, okay, we have achieved stage 2. We are ready to move on now to stage 3, which is where AI adoption stops being just about individual productivity, which is what we were intentionally designing for before. And now it becomes more of an organizational design goal. So as we said, up to now, we've been talking about existing workflows. We've been talking about productivity. Integrated use, this stage 3, begins when that starts to feel inefficient, when teams are realizing that if AI can generate briefs and research and options up front, then the way that the work is sequenced and the way that teams interact may no longer make sense. So the first design move here is to start to think about redesigning workflows to assume AI input early. That second part is important because the idea of redesigning workflows is not an overnight task by any means. But what we do think is a really effective starting point is, instead of redesigning the entire workflow, start to think about where can we assume AI input? Where do we have that starting point, and what does that mean for the rest of the workflow? So that's explicitly deciding that certain artifacts, again, it could be briefs or research summaries, they should arrive already shaped by AI before humans add judgment. Without that very intentional decision, AI is going to feel a little bit more bolted on rather than integrated. Second design decision is being explicit about where human judgment absolutely must enter. So integrated use shouldn't just let AI run unchecked. Basically, it should be focused on deciding which parts of the workflow benefit from speed, from breadth, which require human sense making or trade offs or accountability, and then making that just really explicit to make sure that you don't end up essentially with overtrust and underuse. Third design decision here is team rituals. So kickoffs, reviews, decision forums. They need to start to adapt so that AI generated inputs are treated as real starting material, not just side work or a side project. So if AI outputs aren't explicitly welcome in these moments, it just becomes a lot harder for people to keep using them upstream. And then last point here on the designing success at this stage is around kind of comparability. So shared formats, templates, shared expectations make it much easier to compare different options and outputs and decisions across teams. And this, we found, is kind of what turns individual AI into much more of a collective kind of capability. So this stage is working when teams start with options instead of blank documents, and conversations are just much more naturally referencing AI inputs, and and you will start to see a drop in reworking at those later stages. You'll know that you're ready to move on from stage three when you stop spending basically just a ton of energy debating different workflows, who does what, in what order, and instead you start to use AI to question assumptions and improve the quality of different decisions. So if you are at stage three, then AI generated inputs are no longer new to you. They're very much embedded. The conversation is much more around, are these the right options? What assumptions are we making? What happens if X, Y, or Z scenario plays out? And those are all really good signals that the workflows are no longer the bottleneck and actually judgment is. And that's what we see as the unlock to stage four, which is strategic adoption. So stage four, stage five, I think we certainly know and have worked with companies at this phase. I think most folks are in that phase 1 to 3 at the moment. So it's a over 80% of enterprises are in stages 1 to 3. But I will touch on stage four, which is where AI starts to earn its place in decision making, not just execution. So the goal is not so much analysis, but it's how do we get to much better judgment? And we'll start to see people using AI to expand different option sets or surface risks or challenge assumptions before teams make decisions. The design really does, again, matter at this stage because you have to decide where AI input is expected, and then you need to require that exploration to happen before approvals are made, before commitments are made. So you'll know that this stage is really working when decisions are just backed by a lot more challenged assumptions, broader options, teams are converging faster, confidence is increasing rather than decreasing. We also start to see a lot of kind of acceptance of AI-informed perspectives just becoming the baseline in discussions. They're not something extra. They're not something impressive that's brought to the table. You want to make sure that you're not just using AI as an answer engine. You shouldn't be outsourcing thinking. You should be strengthening it. So something to watch out for there, because strategic adoption really does work most effectively when you are using it as your kind of decision making cavalry, as it were. And another point with this is that leaders do need to be very much involved in this process, where maybe leaders can be less hands-on in the onboarding phase, for example. We do see a lot more involvement as we start to think through how are we as an organization making better decisions. So the transition here is much more about normalization. So when AI-informed thinking is no longer explicitly requested or highlighted or justified, it's just kind of assumed that it's part of how decisions are made. And then the final stage here, I think this is similar to what a lot of folks call AI native companies or AI first companies, companies that really are built around AI and with AI in mind. Obviously, much more common in the early stage startup part of the life cycle than it would be the Fortune 500 part of the life cycle. But ultimately, this is where AI stops being something that you consciously use and it starts just being part of how the organization works. So adoption isn't driven by our champions, by programs, by initiatives. It's just reinforced through roles, through onboarding of roles, through performance expectations, through everyday ways of working. So new joiners are going to pick up AI practices just by seeing how the work gets done. It's not something that they consciously need to assign a separate work stream for. And when this works well, we see that teams are evolving the use cases on their own. The capability is transcending the different tools, the different vendors, the different the different SaaS solutions that you may be buying. You see quality that's much more consistent rather than dependent on just a couple of really high performers. So you'll feel like AI isn't exciting anymore, and that's actually a really good sign. So like I said, stage five, definitely a little rarer in its existence today. So before we move on to kind of the Q&A, I do want to talk a little bit about what we call the super users versus the world. And this is the reality that in practice, a lot of teams are not moving through these stages together at the same time and at the same level. What you instead see almost everywhere is kind of this split, which is that a few people use AI very heavily and they get faster, while others avoid it or use it sporadically and just have more resistance, maybe isn't the right word, but more trepidation when using. What ends up happening is that over time, that gap is going to cause frustration on both sides. You have super users that feel held back. You have non-users that feel like they are either very exposed or they're left behind. So the important point here is that this kind of difference in different types of users is pretty normal in most teams. And it's actually very normal for these periods of rapid technological change. What will cause challenges isn't actually uneven adoption, but it's leaving it unmanaged and just hoping that there'll be this convergence at some point. So a couple of things we'll talk through in the next slide, but when practices are very personal, when they are invisible, again, AI doesn't turn into a shared capability. It just stays locked in individuals, and that individual frustration kind of doubles down. So what we've seen is there's a couple of ways to manage this really effectively. So when adoption is uneven, the instinct is either to really celebrate the super users, or it's to try and push everyone to catch up. And honestly, neither of these things works particularly well. The goal with AI adoption is to change the defaults. It's not to change people. So the first move when you've got a kind of split team, as we call them, is to define a small set of AI default tasks. So as we said, things like first drafts, research summaries, whatever is relevant to your organization, your team, the specific workflows that you're using, try and make those the expected starting point for everyone. That immediately, very easily starts to narrow the gap. Secondly, the super users shouldn't be tasked with having to teach everyone their techniques. It's actually not very helpful. So instead, what is much more helpful is to ask them to show their outputs, show what they start with, what they throw away, what they keep. The goal is to make AI legible. The goal is not to make AI impressive. And then finally, this kind of shift in the work itself. So change the artifacts so that AI input is assumed. So adoption typically spreads through artifacts and routines. It's not actually spread through pure enthusiasm. It is much more kind of direct and tangible than that. So a couple of things that we have seen be successful over the years in terms of an approach that lets your super users keep moving, lets them feel like they can still really run with this, but also gives non-users a very clear kind of low effort way in. And this is kind of some lessons learned from doing this the right way and doing this the wrong way over time. We have seen programs that really elevate the super user and try and get them to spread their techniques with everyone around them and assume a contagion effect. And it just hasn't been as effective as you would think. So summarizing here what we have talked about before we move on to Q&A. A couple of takeaways. Adoption is happening in stages. It's not happening all at once. Each stage has a very different job to do. Most friction comes from actually skipping stages and jumping ahead. And progress is going to come from designing the stage that you are in before moving on to the next stage. So design for that stage, start to think about design for the next stage. If you are looking at AI adoption in your organization, then a couple of helpful next steps could be to try and diagnose which stage you're in as honestly as possible. Again, know that a lot of people are in stages 1 to 3. It's where the majority of teams and companies are. Also know that stage 1, in my opinion, is actually the hardest of all 5 stages. So if you are in the middle of a new AI rollout, if you are responsible for the AI adoption of some new internal, external AI tools, there are a lot of people in your situation. It's a very tough phase. It does require intentionality and very active design. So hopefully the community will focus on this webinar and beyond. And we're always happy to talk about this at VOI if you want to reach out. But just know that it's certainly a difficult stage. So try and make sure that the foundations are in place before pushing for impact. We know that there is a natural tension here where leaders and C-suite are obviously pushing very hard for impact. The quickest way to get there is getting those foundations in place first. So design deliberately for the next stage and use behavior instead of usage as your North Star for progress. So a couple of takeaways and a couple of next steps there. So thank you everyone for sticking through that with us, and we'll save a little bit of time for Q&A if I can find the box. So we've got, okay, lots of different questions here. I'm going to start to move through these. So a couple of questions going from the bottom up. So from Nadia, how do you measure progress at an organizational level, and are there any recommendations? So a lot of different ways to measure progress, and one of the first things that leaders will ask for are the metrics. What are the metrics that we are working towards? What are the metrics that we need to hit to make sure that our AI investment will pay off? And I do think that the measuring progress as behavior is really, really key at the organizational level. Behavior doesn't just mean that it's this abstract concept. You can assign different metrics to behavior. You can assign different confidence levels from the team that reflect behavior. And you can also start to think about what is the impact on the way that we work that comes from behavior change. So don't just focus on the adoption, on the usage metrics. That's the first kind of trap when it comes to organizational progress, but really try and work with your teams to understand what does better look like for us, and then work backwards from that and say, how do we measure what better looks like? But try and stay away from the usage I will say usage can be helpful to float some red flags. If usage is really, really low, you should listen to that. There's an issue there that could be any number of things, but usage shouldn't be ignored completely. It is good for floating red flags. It just shouldn't be the end goal of where you are trying to go. So working through more of these questions. An interesting one actually about management buy-in and potentially lack of consistent management buy-in. That means that employees are also reluctant to buy in. So that's a really interesting one. I'm going to tackle that not from the lens of what to do if you don't have management buy-in. That is very difficult. But I will say that management buy-in is extremely important and needs to be visible. One of the biggest, easiest shifts that we have seen is to kick off the adoption process for a new tool, for a new capability at the extremely senior level. Speak to the team, make a kind of event around it, do a town hall, whatever it may be. But having C-suite, having leaders say to teams, listen, this is the future that we are moving towards, and you have permission to experiment with this. You have permission to be wrong. You have permission to figure this out. That is a huge, huge stress relief for a lot of different teams to know that they don't need to pick this up immediately on day one. They have permission to get things wrong initially, but also to know that there is a directional buy-in, that leaders know that AI is likely going to play a big part in their business and that they are figuring this out alongside you in terms of what that actually looks like. If management does not have buy-in, I don't think that that is, I don't know that that's an AI adoption solve. I think that's probably more of a strategic solve around articulating the AI use cases, articulating what impact on the business those use cases will have, and making sure that those are clearly communicated. And I will say sometimes there are organizations where there just is not leadership buy-in for AI, which is a reality. There are also organizations where, for a lot of use cases, sometimes AI is not the right solve for them. So it does happen. There's not always a solution. There's not always a solution to it, but rooting the use cases in the growth is going to be pretty key. Looking through these questions again. So can you please share examples of the most valuable use cases that are driving real value? So we can definitely share some examples of things that we have worked on in the last, even actually just this year. We're only February, but we see a lot of value across kind of three planes. One is efficiency. It's kind of the least interesting one. But the two that we actually see the most value are in what we call new revenue and revenue optimization. So leveraging AI to identify new revenue streams that can be through AI native innovation, for example, as a use case. So we've done webinars on this recently, but AI native innovation is something that a lot of people come to us for. And essentially what it means is looking at the end-to-end innovation process from insights to new product creation to testing of new products and identifying how can AI help us make better decisions at every stage in this process. How can AI help us get to better insights, hidden signals, unmet needs? How can we leverage AI to innovate against those and generate concepts and use AI to test these in a better way that we can manually across things like desirability and feasibility? So it's a use case that is kind of a collection of smaller use cases that come together to form a capability, but we've seen it completely transform the way that innovation teams work, not just from an automation standpoint. It's really not that. It's allowing them to just get to much better innovation, to test faster, to test in a better way, to opportunity size in a better way, to be able to assess really big data sets that they had to assess manually. So a lot of really interesting use cases across innovation, across marketing, and across commercial functions, especially. And then I think we have time for one more. So Penny Kong has asked that I mentioned that 80% of enterprises are in stages 1 to 3. So what keeps them there and what characterizes the 20% who make it to stages 4 and 5, which is a really good question. I think there's a lot of reasons that companies may not have moved to number 4 yet. I will say I think the most common reason, honestly, is just down to time at this point. Stages 1 through 3 take a lot of time compared to stage 4, for example. So we do see an exponential adoption curve, as you typically see with most emerging technology. But I think that companies right now are still in stages 1, 2, 3 because 1 takes quite a bit of time, 2 takes quite a bit of time. 3 takes a little bit less time. And if you're a large organization, then what's happening is that you're going to have different teams in the organization that are at different stages as well. So you may have a supply chain team that is using AI for various things that is in stage 1. You may have a marketing team that has a really advanced personalization capability, and they are at the top end of stage 3. And what's going to end up happening is that there are connectors between these different teams that somewhat dictate where the entire organization is at. So, for example, IT, for example, infrastructure, legal and compliance constraints. So there is a time element, there is a structural element for large companies. Smaller companies are able to break through to 4 and 5 much, much, much faster than large companies. But I think that stages 1 to 3, different teams move through them at different paces in large companies, and then there's a bit of a barrier to break through at the institutional level when it comes to becoming a lot more AI native and redesigning workflows around AI in stages 4 and 5. Awesome. So I've gone over time here. So thank you everyone for staying with us today.